In generations past, our ancestors were most likely living in a home that had been passed down in their family for many generations. It's only in recent history that has so much of humanity on the move, geographically, but literally into new homes. And thus we have the American dream, right? Owning your own home. Thanks to this new genre of quote-unquote reality TV, and they're very scripted, but that's okay. We also have a plethora. I mean, there are a lot of them out there. Some of you are into them and watch a bunch, but oh my goodness, there's a lot of these home improvement shows where you can experience vicariously the joys and the sorrows of trying to find or trying to build or trying to renovate what they call your dream home, or this other term that I find interesting, your forever home. You're not actually going to live there forever, FYI, unless they're planning on burying you in the basement, which is kind of creepy. So, but whatever. Oddly enough, this desire to fashion a home that's perfect for us, to make it fit our personality and our use and just what we love, may actually be a trait that we inherited from our Creator, who did something very similar when He created the universe. Now, I said last week that the first 3 chapters of Genesis isn't about how or when, but who and why. As we look today at days 1 through 6 of creation, we will definitely see the who, because God will be directly involved. For the why, we're going to look between the lines, because that answer is here as well. So let's look at the beginning of verse 3. It says, "And God said, 'Let there be light.' And there was light." This account of creation has numerous examples of purposeful repetition, things that are repeated on purpose. They have a symbolic value, a poetic value. They're there again and again each day on purpose. And this phrase, "and God said," is one of them, because they all start with that. Each segment of this process each day begins with God speaking into reality what He wants to happen. Now again, this isn't a scientific explanation. "And God said" does not tell us how God was able to make His speech become reality. That's just the way that it's described. It's not telling the Israelites or us how it happened, but who did it. Who was responsible for this? The important point here is that this was the work of God, and God alone. We're not going to see anyone else involved in any of these texts. And it was not a struggle for God to accomplish what He accomplished here, right? He simply spoke. Nor was it an accident or a random occurrence, because but throughout this account, each and every step will be full of purpose and direction from God. This is what God wanted to happen, and in this way. Creation is... Got to pay attention to my own punctuation. Creation, in a move full of symbolism, begins with light. With light itself, not with the sun, but with actual light. We have actually no way to conceptualize what it was like when only God existed. What was there? Nothing. What's that look like? It doesn't look like anything, right? You can't wrap your head around it, because we don't know that. God's first creative act of making something outside of Himself was to make light. Light will then become one of the most common ways to describe the presence of God in the Scriptures. Think about when Moses goes up onto the mountain and speaks to God. He comes back down and his face is glowing from the reflection of that light. Or Jesus during the Transfiguration. It's so bright they're like covering their eyes. That's just the way that God will be described. Even the angels will be described, because they come from His presence as a reflection of light. God saw the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. So light is the first step in giving the universe a form. It now consists of light and not light, which we call darkness, which is rather than a thing. Darkness isn't actually anything. Darkness is simply the absence of light. When you take light away, it's dark. In another example of repetition, we have the first pronouncement that what God is doing here is good. What does good mean in this context? It's not good in the sense that we often use it. Good versus bad, right? Right versus wrong, good versus evil, good or bad. That's not it, not here. And it's not good, better, best, because it's not a statement of comparison. For what could you compare creation itself to? Light was good as compared to what? What's the other thing? There's nothing else. Rather, good, when it's used in the creation account, speaks to the way in which each of the portions, each of the parts of creation are fulfilling their God-given function. Once God has achieved that form that he wants them to have and given them their purpose, they are good because they're doing what God wants them to do. They're also good because God made them without any flaw. Although, what else could a holy and righteous God make? How could God actually make something flawed? It doesn't make any sense. One other way in which calling them good exists in this passage is in foreshadowing, because we all know that it won't be long in the text before evil arrives in chapter 3, and then they will look back and say, that was good. Then it will achieve that good versus not good comparison. We will eventually see that when sin and evil and death enter into the world, they are in fact a negation, a rejection of God's created order. God made it this way. Evil mars it. Evil turns it. We'll look at that when we get to that section in detail. That's an important theological idea. So in addition to the designation of light, calling it day, and dark, calling it night, we have one more repetition to bring this first phase, this first day to a close. There was evening and there was morning. This serves as a poetic symmetry. Each day ends with there was evening and there was morning. A reminder that this is all functioning as God intended it to be. At the end of each phase, at the end of each step, everything is working the way God wants it to. Creation is fully cooperating thus far with its creator. And God said, let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water. So God made the vault and separated the water under the vault from the water above it. And it was so. God called the vault sky, and there was evening, and there was morning, the second day. Now, rather than simply summarizing day 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? You guys can do that, right? You actually know what's happening in this text. It's not a mystery. Oh, we have sky here. Okay. I'm not going to just go through this and summarize and say, here's the sky, here's the plants, here's the land, because you can do that. So what I'm actually going to do is use this story and how it unfolds as a backdrop for us to understand some of the concepts, some of the ideas that would have naturally occurred to those living in the ancient Near East, like the Israelites. The kinds of things that they would see here that aren't obvious to us because, as we said last week, our culture is quite different. Now, that first concept is the most important one for this whole section. And that is the connection between deity, between God, and a temple. Temples existed as dwelling places in the ancient world. Literally, the dwelling place, it was their home for the gods. For Israel, there will be a variation of this concept eventually. And we read that from 1 Kings this morning, one part of that story, when God's glory will dwell within the Holy of Holies. God did not live in the Holy of Holies in the tabernacle or later in Solomon's temple, but his glory dwelt there. That's a little bit different. The Hebrew Scriptures will over and over make it clear that God has no actual need of a physical space to dwell in. Nor is he limited to one place or region. Again, in the ancient world, you built a temple in a holy place, a God dwelt there, and that was his area. Just right around there for a ways. If it was a more important or powerful God, maybe a little bit further. But they were limited to there. If you left that region, if you went somewhere else, you left your gods behind. That's the way people thought. But again, God is not contained in the tabernacle. That is not his home. He is not limited to the Holy Land. Instead, God rules over all the heavens and the earth. Indeed, the entirety of creation is God's temple. As we read from Isaiah, the heavens are my throne, the earth is my footstool. What's a building going to be, right? What's a building made out of stone when the entirety of creation is God's temple? The distinction between the false gods of their neighbors, of the Canaanites, and the one true God whom the Israelites worshiped is demonstrated by this relationship between God and the tabernacle and temple. God chose to dwell with his people in that way. But this didn't mean that God was less omnipresent anywhere else, because God's glory was in the Holy of Holies, in the tabernacle, did not mean that God was not able to be in Asia and South America and anywhere God wanted to be. God is everywhere. Remember, God is spirit. God is not limited as we are, as everything created is, by time and space. Make note of this. While human beings build the temples that the gods dwell in, at least that's what they believed, right? They thought that was the way it worked. And they thought that their idols that they made of wood or stone or jade or whatever they might make them out of were actually the gods dwelling in those spaces. Note that the God of Israel, in his top 10 list, forbids his people to have anything to do with idols. He doesn't want that idea anywhere near his people, because his majesty certainly cannot be represented by a material object. Again, as we heard in Isaiah, I made that thing. That's not me. I made that wood. I made that stone. I'm not in that. By that same line of thinking, even a magnificent temple like Solomon's, or the one that Herod expanded and made probably into one of the finest temples ever, that's not enough for the one true God, whatever you made it out of, however big it might be. Instead, it's the entire heavens and the whole earth that are his abode, his temple. The creation account, then, this way of telling us about creation in chapter 1 of Genesis, is the story of how God made his own temple. He didn't need man to build it for him. He made his own. He made his own abode, his own resting place, as we'll see when we get to day 7. Then God said, I'm at the bottom of this page still. And God said, let the water under the sky be gathered to one place, and let dry ground appear. We could use a little of that. And it was so. God called the dry ground land, and gathered waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. The forming of creation continues. God's demonstrating his authority over that which he has created. Here he gives the land and the sea their own place. This is your place, that's its place. In the description of Solomon's temple in 1 Kings 7, we see some interesting things. We see both a massive bronze basin of water that they called the sea, and bronze pillars symbolizing the foundations of the earth. The design of Solomon's temple is actually a symbolic microcosm of God's true temple, creation. That same symbolism continues inside the temple itself. There you have a menorah providing light. There you have a bread of the presence on a table, corresponding to how God causes the plants in the next verses to provide food, and on and on. The temple structure itself is a repetition of this, symbolically. Then God said, let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to their various kinds, and it was so. The land produced vegetation, plants bearing seed according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed in it, according to their kinds, and God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the third day. Have you ever stopped to wonder about the complexity of the various cycles in the natural world? Not just the seasons, weather and climate and all of that, but the life cycle, the water cycle, and all of these other cycles. So many other ways functioning to make a coherent whole where life can thrive in forms beyond our ability to even count them. The amount of connected interdependence in the natural world is staggering. It extends beyond what the naked eye can see, as we sang in our opening song. There are galaxies beyond our galaxy. And there are microscopic things happening that our ancestors couldn't have even known about. So when they marveled at what God had created, they didn't know the half of it. And that's actually, they didn't know the 1,000th of it or whatever. Some tiny fraction is all they could see. Now, what the role of humanity will be in all of this is what we'll look at next time. Not next week because I won't be here, but in 2 weeks. For now, we will simply note that while the function of each of these various parts is being described to the Israelites as man would see it, we call that an anthropocentric view, the entirety of creation is actually theocentric. For all of this revolves around the presence and purpose of God. That's not my idea. That's from Walton's book that I showed you last week, page 84. I want to give credit because that's a brilliant insight. So with day 3 coming to an end, creation has been given its final form. Again, the purpose is not how or when, but who and why. God is the only who around, right? Nobody else is in this account, so that's pretty straightforward. Beyond the sheer joy of making something beautiful, beyond this idea that the entirety of the world and the universe is his temple, what else is God doing here? Let's keep going. And God said, let there be lights in the vault of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark sacred times and days and years. And let them be lights in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth. And it was so. God made 2 great lights, the greater light to govern the day and the lesser light to govern the night. He also made the stars. God set them in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth, to govern the day and the night, and to separate light from darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the 4th day. Now, we already had light separating from darkness back on day 1. That was form. Now we see that light is given direction and clarity, that it might have God-ordained purpose. It was pleasing to God to set forth the material world in all of its complexity and its interconnectedness. We had an amazing example of that this week, did we not? The one day it wasn't raining, right? You remember that? Our moon, and honestly, our moon is a fascinating thing all by itself because it's a fairly unique object. We've never found a moon as big as this moon is in relation to the thing that it orbits around. Like the moons around Jupiter and Saturn, they're tiny compared to the planet. The moon is huge compared to the planet Earth. Has to do with why we have powerful tides and all of that stuff, but that right itself is pretty amazing. But did you know, and you probably heard this sometime this week from some newscaster trying to sound smart, so I'm not breaking anything that you didn't know, the moon is 400 times smaller than the sun. And it just so happens to be 400 times closer to us than the sun is, making it the only moon that we have ever observed capable of a total solar eclipse. Just what went by us on Monday. No other planet, if you were standing on it, could you have a total solar eclipse, because the moon would be just a tiny speck crossing the surface of the sun, and you wouldn't really want to look at that. But why? Why is that the case? It doesn't serve any material purpose here on Earth, right? The animals freak out for a minute and then they go back about their business. They're not still talking about the eclipse. They're not planning for the next one. They don't care. It's only humanity that will stop and look up at the sky and say, this means something. And of course, it points us in one direction. It points us in the direction of the purpose that God incorporates into all of his creation. And that is this. And here's the second idea: relationship. Creation is God's temple, and it exists to foster the relationship between God and humanity. Our wonder at the beauty of all of this pulls us. It pulls our hearts. It pulls our minds toward our Creator. One more example. There are so many of these. Did you know water expands when it freezes, right? You're aware of this. It makes our roads a real treat every spring, right? Frost heaving. Oh, what a nonsense. But you know what would happen if it didn't? If water contracted as it froze, it would sink to the bottom. And you know what happened to all of those lakes and rivers? They would freeze solid in the winter and kill everything in them. Water floats on water when it freezes. It's a marvel. Why would that happen? It happens for life here on this planet, on the one planet where we've got liquid water and frozen water and water vapor. Our ancestors looking up at the sky, our ancestors pondering this world, said, surely there must be a God who made it thus, who made this place like this. And God said, let the waters teem with living creatures, let the birds fly above the earth across the vault of the sky. So God created the great creatures of the sea and every living thing with which the water teems and that moves about in it according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them and said, be fruitful and increase in number and fill the water in the seas and let the birds increase on the earth. And there was evening and there was morning, the fifth day. You know, plants are pretty marvelous. One of my heroes, of course, is J.R.R. Tolkien. He famously loved trees. There was something about trees that he just was fascinated by, and he wished to elevate them in his literature so people wouldn't be so careless with their axes, cutting them down willy-nilly. But the life that's in them, and the life that is in the fish and the birds that we see here on day 5 is qualitatively different. This is a step up. Day 6 will contain one more big step from the animals to humanity. The miracle that the ancient Israelites could not have known is how every living thing, us included, is made up of the exact same elements as the inanimate soil and rocks and water, let alone the sun and the moon and everything else. They're all the same elements. The same elements as the living plants, who don't have the capacity to think and feel, are the ones that make up the animals that do think and feel. But they cannot contemplate their existence or their purpose like we, and yet all made of the same hydrogen and oxygen and calcium and iron and nitrogen and carbon and all those things on that big chart that you were supposed to learn about in high school and promptly forgot because it was a lot. On and on. Human beings made of the same stuff. And yet, God made us alone with that final level of awareness. Didn't make us out of different stuff, just made us differently. We'll return to that thought next time. But that circle of life thing at the start of The Lion King, that's a real thing. That's correct, because the stuff that you are made of right now was once a part of other things. Living things and non-living things, and will again be one day when your time is over. It all breaks down, it gets reconstituted again. It's amazing. What a marvelous creation we have here. What an awe-inspiring creator. And we'll end with the last day, the sixth day. And God said, let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, the livestock, the creatures that move along the ground, the wild animals, each according to its kind. And it was so. God made the wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. So lastly then, we have here in Genesis 1's description of God's creative work a firm picture of monotheism. For only God has been involved in any of this. A purposeful and well-ordered planet and heavens have been created that has been made with a huge variety of living things inhabiting it. And this is setting it up. This is tailor-made for God's creation of humanity that'll take place in the next verse, which will bring day 6 and the entirety of God's creative work to close. The only thing we haven't looked at is the creation of mankind. For the ancient Israelites, whom God, through Moses, was leading from bondage in Egypt to the promised land where they would finally become a nation and not just a people, this text offers a common understanding of the foundation of their relationship with God. They would know that before God called Abraham and before God set them apart as a chosen people, God had made all of humanity. And God made the entire world and everything that lies beyond it. Having made all that, God chose to tell them about his role as creator, to disavow any notion that anyone else had a hand in it, and to show them that his desire to instill purpose into all that he makes goes way back to the beginning and includes them. So for us as the church, God's people whom he has called from all of the nations to join the new covenant, the covenant of salvation by grace through faith in Jesus, this knowledge of God as creator has value to us as well. We too have been given a role and a purpose in the will of God, as God gave to everything he created. And we too trace our relationship with God back to his promise to Abraham. For it is through Abraham's descendant Jesus, the Messiah, that God brought about the redemption of all peoples, showing himself to be not only our creator, but our Redeemer. 3 things to remember. Number 1, God's creation was a solo endeavor, one filled with orderliness and purpose. Secondly, the entirety of creation is God's dwelling place, his temple. And then lastly, let us then stand in awe of our wondrous Creator, the Lord of heaven and earth.